Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever part of the world you're joining us here at the Asia Society today. My name's Kevin Rudd. I'm President and CEO of the Asia Society, and we're gathering together today a first-class panel of speakers and analysts on what is now happening in Afghanistan since the extraordinary developments we saw unfolding on our television screens literally last weekend. I think for all of us who have been concerned about the Asia Society's broader remit, which is peace and stability and development across the wider region, Afghanistan has never been far from our focus. For myself, as a former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, I have been in and out of the country many, many times over the years, meeting with Ashraf Ghani and prior to that with Hamid Karzai, not just in Kabul, but also traveling to the north of the capital and to the south, and the part of the country where we Australians were responsible in Afghanistan's poorest province, Orizgan, and the center of that province, Tarin Kowt. And I think speaking therefore for the international community, and certainly the community of concerned Americans observing what has happened here in the country, literally in the last week or so, there has been an extraordinary interest on the part of our membership and our supporters right across the world to understand with some granularity how this came about, what is now happening on the ground within the country, and how this is likely to unfold domestically, politically, economically, and geopolitically, given the extraordinary array of powerful neighbors that Afghanistan has: China, the Russian Federation, of course, Pakistan, India as well, and Iran not all that far away. And we're privileged today to be joined by a spectacular panel of experts. We're going to hear from Vali Nasr, who is the Majid Kaduri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council South Asia Center. He served as the 8th Dean of Johns Hopkins SACE, and between 2012 and 2019 served as Senior Advisor to US Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, and that was between 2009 and 2011. So Vali, it's good to have you with us. Vali will be followed by Laurel Miller. Laurel also has a distinguished career background in Afghanistan. She, between 2013 to mid-2017, was the Deputy and then Acting Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the United States Department of State. She's now Director of the International Crisis Group's Asia Program, and she brings also enormous expertise to this question, as well as having previously a distinguished career and various positions in the United States State Department. And finally, we have Mohammad Nader Yama. Yama joins us today, I believe, from Ottawa, where he is the Deputy Chief of Mission in the Afghan diplomatic mission in Canada. For us at the Asia Society, he's also part of our family. He's a member of Asia 21, one of the group of 1,000 alums that we have had participate in leadership training programs through the Asia Society over the last 15 years. And prior to his career at the Afghan mission in Canada, he's also held a number of other positions within the Afghan government and within the United Nations Development Program in Afghanistan itself. So we have a rich pool of talent to draw upon this morning. Format will be very straightforward. I'll turn to Vali first for 5, 6, or 7 minutes for his opening remarks about the current state of things, internal and external. Then I will ask Laurel Miller to follow and to bring Nader Yama up the end. And then I'll engage in an open conversation with the panel. And if you've got questions, please get them into us, because they will be sent to me on my cell phone to make sure that we are able to bring those questions to bear with this extraordinarily well-informed, talented and experienced panel of experts. So without further elaboration, Vali Nasr, over to you first, and tell us what you think is happening in the country and where it's going to go to from here.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thanks to Asia Society for inviting me. And I'm very honored to be with my fellow panelists, Laurel and Nader, on this panel. I mean, off the bat, I have to say that, this is a tragic scenario for the people of Afghanistan, for a country that's been almost without any stopping at 4 decades of war, starting with the Soviet invasion of that country in 1979. And although we focus a lot on security issues that impacts the West, I'm particularly mindful of the impact it has on the social changes, on people who have been involved in the social changes that the United States brought about during the past 20 years, the middle class, the women, the people who got engaged in a new economy in Afghanistan. And now the rug has been pulled from under them. And that truly is a tragedy for the region as well as for Afghanistan. So the question of how do we get here, at least to my reading, that even when President Trump came into office in 2016, the Taliban were winning. They were winning slowly. The US was losing more and more territory to them. Violence was on the rise. And I think at that point, the United States realized that it's facing a strategic choice, that either it has to double down, increase troops and commitment in order to reverse that direction, or it had to really get out, that a slow defeat to the Taliban was not a good idea. And I think President Trump made the decision that he was not willing to double down on Afghanistan. And yes, as given his control of the Republican Party, he could be sure that the most sort of neoconservative pro-war faction of the American political stream could not stand up to him. He had the political room to engage with the Taliban. I mean, who would have thought that the US would sit across the table with the Taliban? I remember when I was in government with Ambassador Holbrooke, that it was said that should not be put in writing, and the president should not be exposed to that option, because all hell would break loose if it got out that President Obama was even thinking about talking to the Taliban. And yet President Trump could think freely that he could invite the Taliban to Camp David and get away with that politically. I do think that the Doha talks were flawed in many ways the way they started. It's almost like the end result was already baked in the way we approached the deal. It was a cessation of hostilities deal between the two major combatant forces on the ground, and a political settlement with Kabul was sort of an afterthought that then the United States cannot force on the Taliban. And as time ran out, it essentially gave up on that idea. And I think many people in the region I spoke to at that time, when Doha started, thought that the United States had already pretty much reconciled itself to a Taliban takeover of power. Now, as a consequence of this deal, the United States whittled down its troops from 15,000 to 2,500. So when President Biden came in, we had far fewer troops than we had in 2016. And yet there is an impression that those 2,500 somehow were keeping the peace in Afghanistan. They were largely because the Taliban stopped shooting at us as part of the Doha Agreement. And I think the issue was out there that if the United States did not abide by Doha, if the United States tried to stay longer, as now people are suggesting outside, that then, the gloves could come off. The Taliban could start killing Americans. And I suspect that the Biden administration was very mindful that no Americans die before they leave, because that could undo the Doha Agreement altogether. And I think that's still a concern right now, as they're trying to get out as fast as they can, get Americans out as fast as they can without any Americans dying, because that would be a game changer. The issue then is, why did it collapse? And my colleagues probably know much more, but I think it's at any time the United States would have left, it would have been a problem for Afghanistan. I mean, first of all, a lot of the economy of Afghanistan was foreign military expenditure that had created a big economy in Afghanistan. That money disappeared, and it was disappearing and has now disappeared altogether. And secondly, when we left, largely the entire skeleton that was upholding the Bonn Agreement system and the Kabul government would have been gone. there are also local facts that we can't control. I mean, there is a lot of discussion about the manner in which President Ghani left, and I'm sure Nader knows a lot more about that. But at least, reading what my friend and CEO of Tulu TV, Saad Mohseni, has said, that there was negotiations over a deal that would have delayed Taliban entry into Kabul for 2 weeks. The Taliban were actually eager on that because they didn't think they had capacity to immediately take control of the city. And the minute that President Ghani left without anybody's basically knowledge, that the entire thing fell apart. Now, perhaps the United States should have managed President Ghani better, but the reality of it was that was a decision that was not in the United States' control. Now, going forward, I don't think we quite know, what to expect. I mean, first of all, there's a question that is this the same Taliban? And I think there are big differences. I mean, the way in which they actually moved through Afghanistan without a battle, the fact that they are engaged with the region in the manner they are. In 1994, when they came in, they massacred Iranian diplomats and journalists just because they were Shia. This time, not only they've gone to Iran, but today is the most important Shia celebration. And the Taliban are providing security to Ashura ceremonies in Mazar Sharif and Kabul. And the symbolism of that in Pakistan and in other places where they've taken their cue from that kind of hardline Sunni view is notable. But the Taliban are 75,000 men. Can they control a country? Can they exert discipline on their own population? So we're very focused on what happens if, what the Taliban would do. I'm also worried about what happens if the Taliban lose control. If there is not one government in Afghanistan again, and that either the Taliban fractures or you have serious resistance, because then they cannot control who's going to come and set up shop in their midst. Now, and I would say governance for the Taliban is a tall order, not only because they don't have experience, but because they really don't have the manpower and the capacity to rule over 34 million people, unless that 34 million people give some kind of a consent to rule. And that really, in my opinion, requires people like Karzai, Abdullah, many local power brokers to agree to work with the Taliban. And that really falls on the Taliban, whether they're willing to persuade them or not. And so we don't know that. And then on the region, I think to some extent, everybody expected the Taliban was going to take over. That's why the Chinese, the Iranians, the Pakistanis, Uzbeks, Russians had started welcoming them and talking to them and trying to sort of give them an impression that they could be accepted by them, provided they behaved, and they kept Afghanistan under some kind of a united rule. But as recently a former Iranian ambassador to Afghanistan tweeted, it's too early to know who are the regional winners and losers in this. Because a lot, again, depends on what happens. But I think at the bare minimum, I think everybody around Afghanistan has an interest in the country not falling apart. And the Taliban behaving as a government rather than behaving as a revolutionary movement like they did in the 1990s. So the question is, can the United States help in that process? Can we be an encouraging force, or can we end up being a destabilizing force?
Thank you, Vali. That's a great way to start our discussion. And so many questions arise from that in terms of the durability of the agreement reached in Doha between the Taliban and the United States, whether the Taliban hold together, and whether the multifaceted nature of the beast, if you like, is going to unfold in a way which will be different in the capital from in the provinces. Let's bring in Laurel Miller. Laurel, over to you. In particular, perhaps you could enlighten our viewing audience on what actually was the nature of the agreement struck in Doha. What's therefore going to be the benchmark against which we hold this Taliban regime for the period ahead? Over to you, Laurel.
Thanks very much. I can say a word about that, and then I'd also like to make a brief backward-looking point and then maybe a point looking ahead. As for the agreement that was signed in February 2020 between the US and Taliban at Doha, I don't think it has a whole lot of relevance anymore. I mean, one can choose to reference it on either the Taliban side or the American side as one wishes. But to suggest that the agreement is somehow still binding on the two sides, given everything that's happened since then, I think is very difficult to do. I think the agreement did turn out to be convenient for the Biden administration, given that it wanted to withdraw, and this gave a hook to hang that decision on, at least in part. But I don't think that the agreement actually drove the Biden administration's decision to withdraw. I think it was President Biden's own assessment and prioritization of US national security interests that drove that. The agreement had the United States committing in a very specific way to a timetable for withdrawal from Afghanistan. It also called for sanctions relief for the Taliban, which hasn't been followed through on as yet. It called for some prisoner releases by the Afghan government, which was partially the erstwhile Afghan government, which was partially followed through on. And it called for the Taliban to not break ties with terrorist groups, but to restrain terrorist groups that are present in Afghanistan, to keep a lid on these groups in various ways. I wouldn't doubt that the US would refer back to those commitments as and when it wants to stress the importance of the Taliban adhering to those assurances. But if the Taliban wanted to, they could point to both sides can point to multiple ways that the agreement was not actually implemented as it was drafted. The real importance of the agreement was that it created a window of opportunity for launching an Afghan peace process. It was a calculated bet on the part of the United States that by agreeing to a specific timetable for withdrawal, that the US could wedge open a window of opportunity for an Afghan peace process. If all the United States wanted to do was withdraw and it didn't have any interest in trying to launch a political settlement process among the Afghans, it could have just withdrawn and negotiated that with the Afghan government. It didn't have to negotiate with the Taliban about that. And I'm really hard pressed to believe any American thought that the counterterrorism assurances in that agreement were somehow going to be, deeply and permanently binding on the Taliban. So I think it's, in my view, it's predominantly a historical artifact now, though I wouldn't exclude that someone references it now and then as politically convenient. Now, I mean, the point I wanted to make, looking back a little bit, but not too far, excuse me, is to address a question that has been raised a lot in recent days, which is, was the rapid collapse of the Afghan government and Afghan security forces a surprise? And my short answer to that is no, it was not a surprise. That all of the factors that contributed to the collapse were long evident. There was no new factor introduced into the equation in recent days, weeks, or months that precipitated this rapid collapse. And it was one of only two basic plausible scenarios for what would happen in the aftermath of an American withdrawal. One of those scenarios was rapid collapse. The other was that after some further gains on the part of the Taliban, that the conflict would settle into a protracted and probably intensified civil war focused on the larger towns and cities. I think it was really, in my view, I thought the latter was somewhat more probable than rapid collapse, but that could just be that more or less continuity with the status quo is always a bit easier to fathom than much more dramatic upheaval. But, even 6 or 7 years ago, during the time that I was in the State Department working on Afghanistan, we assessed that rapid downward spiral was a highly plausible outcome as and when the US decided to withdraw from Afghanistan. And that was at a time when the Taliban was not as strong as it has been in the period immediately preceding the withdrawal. So there was a lot of uncertainty about which way it would go. I mention this now because I think there's a bit of a brewing finger pointing, at least here in Washington, with some suggesting that there was an intelligence failure because the reported intelligence assessments of how quickly the Afghan government could fall were revised from a couple of years to some months to something much shorter. And I think there's some lessons to learn here, both for how to think about these kind of assessments and also about policy planning for different scenarios. And that's why I mentioned the point. I think as I'm sure many people in this audience appreciate, but maybe isn't more popularly appreciated, intelligence analysis is only probabilistic assessment. They can't predict the future any better than any of us sitting here can do, or any well-informed observers can. And it's really up to policymakers to decide what are tolerable degrees of probability and which plausible scenarios to plan for when scenarios are not equally probable, as they never are. So I think it will be important for the United States and others to reflect on what happened in the last weeks and months for some lesson learning, but not to start pointing fingers, particularly at the intelligence community. Now, looking forward, I would like to stress, though using this word opportunity very carefully in these very grim circumstances, that there is an opportunity for the United States now to make good on the assertion of US officials that as it pivots away from the use of military means in Afghanistan, that it would pivot towards use of diplomatic means and economic assistance means to remain engaged in Afghanistan and its region. At this moment, there is really a dire humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. There was already, even before the recent developments and the collapse of the government, because of conflict, because of the COVID pandemic, because of a drought in Afghanistan, because of increased displacement of people internally and refugees flowing out from Afghanistan. And I know that the United States is absorbed at the moment in this very dramatic evacuation process that we're seeing unfold, but I do think this is also a moment for urgent and concerted diplomatic initiative to marshal international humanitarian support for the Afghan people generally, as well as specifically for displaced persons and refugees. I think that's important in and of itself to do, but could also be a very important counterbalance to the effects that are going to be felt by the Afghan people because of the wait and see posture that the US and others understandably are taking towards recognition of the Taliban government. That soon-to-be government, it isn't actually in place yet, could soon be in very serious economic straits. We've seen reporting in recent days of the US freezing the central bank assets. Obviously, aid flows are going to stop. This is a government that has been, the pre-existing government was for 75% of its budget dependent on donor resources. The IMF has frozen its resources for Afghanistan. So, the Taliban is going to have a very tough row to hoe in building up the competence that it needs to have if it's going to actually operate the machinery of government, even apart from international attitudes towards it. But the financial flows that are going to be at a minimum suspended to Afghanistan, the results of that are going to be felt by the Afghan people. So I think there's also a need for much more visible and robust regionally oriented diplomacy on the part of the United States, more than the occasional conversations with counterparts. the focus of that should be on shaping common messages directed towards the Taliban to try as much as possible, and the possibilities are limited, but as much as possible to moderate how they govern, how they treat the Afghan people. Those countries in the region, Pakistan, China, Russia, Iran, are most likely going to have more influence over a Taliban government in Afghanistan than the United States. And so the US will have to engage with those countries as much as possible in order to exercise any kind of influence over the Taliban. Now, I mean, of course, the Biden administration does not want to spend a lot of time on Afghanistan. The president said so in announcing his withdrawal decision and justifying it when he enumerated all of the higher priorities for this administration: competition with China, the COVID crisis, climate change, cybersecurity. Those are things that he's explicitly pointed to as higher priorities for US national security interests. But I think whatever anyone thinks about the correct prioritization of US interests, or whatever one's views are on whether the US has any obligations that it owes to the Afghan people after the last 20 years, I think even just the battering that America's image has taken in recent days would seem to justify directing greater and more visible attention to a campaign of support for the Afghan people.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Laurel, and for bringing the conversation back to the immediate needs of the Afghan people in the midst of the political and security implosions within the country. Let's come back to that in our discussion. Yama, thank you for joining us. You're on the front line of this in terms of not just being an Afghan national yourself, representative of the government of Ashraf Ghani, and also with many, many friends in Kabul right now. Perhaps you could begin your remarks by giving us a sense of what's happening on the ground, even in your own ministry and other ministries of the government, before reflecting more broadly on the questions we've been discussing so far. Over to you, Yama.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's absolutely a pleasure to be part of this panel and discussion and talk about one important issues related to Afghanistan. Just before I say anything, I just want to make a correction. That I used to be former employee of the government in the mission in Ottawa, but also in an organization, and it's called Independent Director of Local Governance in Afghanistan, was Deputy Minister. But I'm now a member of the Afghanistan Center for Policy Studies. So my viewpoints would be, Kevin, from two perspectives. One, as somebody who's, lived the engagement of the international community in the last 20 years, and particularly, being part of the technical level in the government, pushing and facilitating reforms, either seconded by the UN or being partner with the international community, or taking leadership in some government position, but also as an Afghan who've been watching and living and seeing, being part of the 3 decades of and 4 decades of conflict. So let me just begin with a quote. I've just was talking this morning to a young leader in Afghanistan. She said, "I wish we would not be awakened. And it seems like we have been 20 years in sleep, and we wished that we did not have that dream." So people in Afghanistan currently, whether those that used to work with the government or outside, they see the situation as total failure, abundance, betrayal. And when you talk to them, it seems like you talk to a body, not to a body with a soul. So they lost hope, they lost belief in what they've been seeing and practicing in terms of democratic values, human rights, and particularly international community helping them to see a different light and different future. And we all who've been in the past in Afghanistan now here, are also with the pain of seeing what's happened. We're shocked, we're in pain, and we're trying to somehow find ways to help one or some in Afghanistan, where there are 30 million, particularly 22 million below the age of 25. A potential used to be potential for socioeconomic development, now a potential for disaster. So in relation why we reached to this situation, I would look to different, dividing this 20 years into two parts. One, a pre-transition period, that what I would call it a period of excitement and conflict, or conflicting phase, but also a transition and transformation phase, which used to be given a title by the ex-president of Afghanistan. So in the first phase, definitely we've had, we've got the administration, we've got the constitution, we've got human rights and freedom of speech, but also we've had abundance of resources. So we've been running when it comes to pushing for reform. Check and balance were not there. A more of resulted in a more patronage kind of system, where different ministries were controlled by different power brokers, and not necessarily there wasn't a vision or there was whole of government understanding where they're heading. And of course, as we moved on to 2007 and 8 and 9, the government started to have conflict with the international community. Perceived that, there's a parallel structures, and the government is being bypassed, but also corruption was rampant, and the system wasn't able, despite of reforms, to be able to deliver in terms of security, development, and stability. So we moved from 2000, almost 2014 on post-transition. This period until 2021, my personal thing, I was basically took position as a deputy minister. So I started to lead a policy reform and more of looking toward decentralized practices, more of giving more authority to the governors, to local authorities, so that they be in a state of being able to function in a better way. So we started to see that we've been concerned that the government will not sustain, but actually it's sustained. We could see a bit of commitment and clarity of path and vision, and kind of nation awakening in terms of we have somebody who's a leadership and a reform is about to come to place where the system would function and the delivery of services would be effective. But as we moved on the next 2 to 3 years, we've realized that that's not the case. So much of the policies, practices, and reform agenda were either inappropriate, discriminatory, narrow-minded, and importantly, it was exclusionary. That led to more of more excessive centralization of the practice. The ministers were not having authority, were not having resources, and of course, they were not been in a position to deliver. And that was the case at the local level. Particularly, that was the time when I left the government. But meantime, political conflict and tension, aggressive reform agenda being pushed where the system wasn't. So we were in the middle of, two extremes, either extreme of not having clarity and vision and commitment, and then extreme of that without understanding how the path needs to be laid down so that these visions need to be implemented, how they need to be implemented. You need a team, you need a system, and you need to have a whole of government approach where, from my perspective, it was more of central state functioning rather than the central government below the central of state, which would be the ministries or the local government were functional. I've also realized that much of my friends that we've lived through the technicality of process in terms of building capacity and pushing for reforms, they start to either leave the government or they've been taken out from the government. And more of youngers, would be more than happy that somebody comes with different views, but actually, practical experience and understanding of the context And it's not about only technicality. It's about someone who would be tolerant, someone who would be understanding the context in the periphery, someone who would be able to speak and to find a middle ground or create an environment for discussion. That wasn't there. So we came up with more aggressive reform, more aggressive statement, and that made the opposition, all the countries, disappointed, provoked to take more aggressive, position. What also enabled both the phase 1 and phase 2? The first, as I said, extreme shift of commitment and action. And second thing, I strongly believe that much of our practices, either due to flood of resources, and it wasn't conceptually appropriate practices and approaches. We tried to push things in the provinces where the system wasn't and the capacity wasn't there to absorb it, and it led to corruption. We've been simply not listening to the public. Absolutely, I was seeing in governance, to me, what I learned is about listening. It's about creating an environment for people to come and talk to you. It's about respecting. And it's about creating an environment, again, so that all institutions build understanding and collectively, in a coordination manner, deliver. So that wasn't happening. And I think what gives me an understanding that what has happened recently, it wasn't a surprise, as Dr. Miller said, or Nasr. It was a cumulative of failed practices, either technically, either politically, or meantime, what has added on is social media and conspiracy theory. So now we are in the state where, as Dr. Miller said, the government is not functioning. There's no government, actually. Services are not being delivered. People have fear, depending on what experience they have from the past. But what is needed, what is there already, is we need to understand that we need to, in any way possible, we need to preserve what we have achieved to an extent possible. State institutions, human rights, freedom of speech. There are signs of hope. Women's in the street, that they're claiming for their rights. And people talk about without any fear when somebody approaches them and interview them. And last thing I want to do when it comes to evacuation, I do want to say that the deadline has to be extended. It's no way that with the setup we see that it would be possible to evacuate. The command and control and coordination and system responsive to the high demand, overwhelmed, request is still not there. And as again emphasized on preparation for humanitarian crisis, how to manage that. That's coming up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yama, and thank you to all of our panelists for their contribution. Let me begin with a series of, we're getting lots of questions in. I'd like to begin with questions with a view to getting a short, sharp sort of 60 seconds from each of you on these questions, or just pass if it's something you'd rather not comment on. And I'm taken first and foremost by the observation from Laurel before, and it's reinforced by questions that I've got. Taliban force of 75,000. What was the size of the Afghan National Army at the time of, as it were, the collapse last weekend? And do any of you have any further reflections on why the ANA, after 10 and a half years, or 10 to 15 years, I should say, of training by various governments around the world, performed so poorly?
Well, I'll let Laurel give the actual numbers. I'm sure she has a better handle on that. From what I've gathered, I think the answer is partly political, that because there was the lack of a very clear leadership in Kabul, that the various elements in the military, various people in the military began to lose heart in terms of being able to resist the Taliban, and it made it easier for the Taliban to cut deals with local commanders in order to have them lay down their weapons.
Okay, that's good. Laurel, on the question of the size of the Afghan National Army at the time of collapse.
So, I mean, first of all, the numbers of Taliban fighters, it's just, no one knows. I mean, there have been estimates over time, and that's entirely opaque. 75,000 is a reasonable estimate, but we don't really know, and those numbers are fluid over time. On the Afghan government side, some have bandied around the number 300,000, but when you delete from that police who are not offensive forces, who are manning checkpoints, if doing anything at all, if you delete from that people involved in logistics and other things, and really get down to what are the number of fighters, the estimates I've seen are more in the 80 to 95,000 range. And even that's a little uncertain because of the number of so-called ghost soldiers, people who are on the books, but they don't really exist. And it's just a way of, it's corruption. It's sort of people having fake people on the books and then taking the pay that was intended for them. In terms of why they performed poorly, I mean, some of this over a long period of time has to do with the natural advantages of an insurgency and it being much more difficult to be the counterinsurgent, the government that has to defend everywhere, as opposed to the insurgent that is able to be more selective in their strategy. But then at the end, I think what we see is a lot of ways in which the system failed the soldiers rather than the soldiers failing the system. I mean, you see widespread reports of soldiers not being properly paid, not being properly fed, the most capable soldiers, the commandos, being overused and exhausted. This speaks to bad systems, bad strategy, and failing those people not being brave enough to fight if they were enabled to.
Thank you very much for that. Yama, can I just flip the question in a slightly different direction? What do you now see is going to happen with each of the ministries? Have they ceased to function? Will they be a hybrid of Taliban plus pre-existing government personnel? Or are we going to be effectively in an administrative vacuum? Just a quick minute or two from you on that.
As an example, I was just talking to a friend and reading on the news as well in the Ministry of Public Health. A committee of Taliban's responsible for public health, they approached the minister and the organization and demanding that they have to be present and they have to deliver services. That has happened. But I do think that we should not make a mistake as we did in the past that would think that the system is not there, or the Taliban would say that everybody has to get out and we need to be there. And also the previous administration, when they took power, they tried to clean up because they thought that everybody is trustworthy to the previous government. And actually, you weaken the system. I hope that's not the case. I hope that they would come to consensus, and the staff, and particularly the civil service, servants, they would be there. And but again, how much of them would be there because there's so many people are leaving, as well.
Okay, Laurel, a question for you again, coming in from our audience, which is you've mentioned the humanitarian crisis now being faced by the people of Afghanistan. What's the central role of the United Nations right now? Is it required that we have an enhanced UNDP presence to begin to coordinate donor assistance for basic food and medical supplies if the economy is beginning to implode? Over to you, Laurel.
Yeah, I mean, the UN is still on the ground in Afghanistan. They have kept their offices, including their regional offices, open. I think the role of the specialized agencies, those that are focused on humanitarian assistance and other forms of aid to the Afghan people were already essential and are now more so. And we've seen a number of messages from international NGOs, from the International Committee of the Red Cross saying they are still there, they don't intend to leave. And I would expect that most of the aid that would be going to the Afghan people will not be on a bilateral basis towards the Taliban, but will be through UN agencies and the international NGOs. But it has to be said that even before these recent developments, the various humanitarian appeals for Afghanistan, the funding appeals, and also for UN High Commissioner for refugees in neighboring states were woefully undersubscribed. And that's part of the reason why I'm pointing to the need for governments, including the United States, to really take a leadership role in in banging the drum and getting people to pony up for these various funds and funding mechanisms that do exist.
Yeah, it goes to a question I've got from, again, the audience about what the average person can do in supporting the people of Afghanistan at this stage as the average person in the rest of the world. You just mentioned the International Council of the Red Cross. I would assume, therefore, that people watching this broadcast want to contribute and support that the ICRC remains a very useful and credible mechanism to provide real and material assistance. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to endorse any one organization over another, but I have seen messages from ICRC saying, they are providing assistance to the Afghan people. That is one way to go. There are other organizations, MSF, other healthcare focused organizations that are still active and have been in Afghanistan for a very long time. Some of these organizations, even during the last Taliban period. There are also, I would point out, at least I know for some American communities, I don't know about elsewhere, probably in Canada as well, there are organizations that are involved in supporting the refugees that are being accepted into various countries. And I think there's for people really at a community level who want to help individuals, there's a lot of opportunity there.
Thank you very much. Another question comes in probably for you, Vali, which is, in your understanding of the country, and Laurel, please feel free to come in as well, what arrangements would the Taliban have made with various tribal groupings across the country in order to prepare for this transition to power? Any thoughts?
I mean, we don't know for sure, but usually historically the deals would happen with tribal leaders, with community leaders. That some of the, say, soldiers that are working in the military or various other state institutions would belong to particular regions or tribes, and the Taliban may cut a deal with grandees in those areas. What is very interesting is that the Afghan army did not perform on the battlefield badly, and in fact it was taking a lot of casualties before this last phase of the exit, but rather decided that it didn't want to fight, and it didn't just abandon the fight. That there were negotiations happening that led to them surrendering. But I also think there was a snowballing effect. In other words, as the Taliban began to conquer more and more area, the argument became more compelling that it was pointless to fight and it was better to negotiate with them.
Let's go to other questions which go to the nature of this new Taliban 2.0 versus Taliban 1.0. If you were to try and synthesize in sort of 3 or 4 points, dot points, starting with you, Yama, what do you perceive to be the difference between the Taliban as it was and the Taliban as it is in core substantive terms?
Well, I think initially there's initial perception of the Taliban at the beginning, before 9/11 and after. They seemed to be very positive, starting with a very positive behavior, but right after the first 2 days. For 9/11, the assassination of Dr. Najibullah, that was a scary scene, and of course, the brutality started and it continued. And while there was fighting, but now there's no fight. But still, people do carry on the image of the previous Taliban, and they fear, and that's why the shocking scenario you have seen in the airport. What I strongly believe that there are different groups of Taliban. And you have the leadership who are try to be positive, try to be open, try to assume and have the support of the international community recognizing them. But also you have the commanders in the field that they're totally different. They're more extreme, they're more radical, behavior-wise, even expression-wise. And there are lots of documentaries already by the BBC and everybody that you see that the difference between these two. I've just quote, I don't want to mention the name, I don't want to cause any security threats, but I was talking yesterday to a former minister who was caught in Kabul. He was, his house was 3 times searched, and each 3 times you have 3 different groups of Taliban. And the last one luckily recognized him as someone who used to be, serving their district, and he done a good job, and he recognized him, and he took a selfie. Meantime, he sent me that selfie. But meantime, the minister said, or the ex-minister said that, the previous Taliban group, they threatened me that if I don't bring these 2 cars, which I don't have, I will be killed. And the third group say that, yes, that group of Talibans, they are terrorists. So now what gives you that, impression of, and this search house to house, probably to collect the guns, probably to collect vehicles or information. But to me, confiscation of an organization that used to be an institute dealing on peace and war, it shows me clearly that there are different groups, different perspectives. So it's yet to judge, early to judge, I would say, in terms of how different they are. But definitely they've learned a lesson, particularly the leadership. But I think part of the movement, there are radicals that they've been inspired by the ISIS, and probably there are groups that they're beyond control of. Soon we will see beyond the control of the leaders. And I also see the trick between how the leaders state against how the commanders will perceive their statement in terms of being open-minded a bit in relation to international expectation of them.
Laurel, on this question of Taliban 2.1, 2.0, 1.0, 2.0, can you give me your thoughts on that? I've got to say, as an external observer, but someone who's spent some time in the country myself, I'm profoundly skeptical about the likely difference between the public relations machine we see underway at the moment and, for example, what's happening on the ground in Kandahar as we speak. So your thoughts on the essential difference between these 2 Talibans?
Sure. So, we've certainly seen a difference in terms of their foreign policy, if you want to put it that way. How they interact with the world, what kind of face they show to the world, their communications machinery, both internally directed towards their movement, but also externally. And the kinds of reassurances that they have sought to convey to the neighbors in the outside world. But at the same time, even though they do have this political commission, people who have been essentially the diplomats of the Taliban movement who have been engaging with the outside world, they have fundamentally over these last years since they regrouped, been an insurgency. They have not had a defined political program, political vision that they have conveyed, except in just the most general terms, to anyone. And so, what they are going to be like in terms of their domestic policy and how they are going to govern, we simply don't know. We don't even know the extent to which they have actually thought this through. We do know that it's human behavior to lean on the experience you have and the templates and the experience that they have at the leadership level is how they governed in the 1990s. And there is some continuity, considerable continuity of personnel at that level, even though there's been this kind of generational change that was already referenced among the the fighting forces. So, it's sort of logical to think that when they're not sure what to do, that there will be ways in which they lean on the experience and the templates that they're familiar with. They say that they have learned lessons from mistakes that they made and how they governed in the past, but what precisely they think are the mistakes and what are the lessons, we don't know because they haven't said. So, I think skepticism is warranted. I think we also have to consider they haven't been preserved in amber and time has gone on, and we should have something of an open mind, at least as in these early period of time, there is some engagement with them and trying to push them in favorable directions. But, of course, skepticism is warranted.
Yes, by all means, Vali. And I want to come back to the question of their policy towards women. But Vali, you first, and I'll come back to women.
I fully agree with what Yama and Laurel said, but I would also add that, listening, for instance, to Yama, their behavior in Kabul with these different factions, etc., looks a lot like sort of stories of when revolutionaries take over and that way in which they encounter the established society going forward. And as is the case with revolutions, as for instance, your experiences with China, there is a difference between the leaders and the foot soldiers. And I think the leadership of the Taliban, those who are negotiating with the United States in Doha, many of them have been sitting outside of Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Iran, in Qatar, have been traveling around, and they have gained a different kind of a perspective about the outside world and about needs of governance that they didn't have when they were the young revolutionaries and the young firebrands of the 1990s. And there is a generational divide. One regional diplomat who had spoken with one of these senior Taliban who's in Doha said to me that that Taliban leader told them that the younger generations who's fighting in the field thinks of us as having grown old and soft, and in that sense, the way we see the world and the way we see how to govern Afghanistan is different from them. They want absolute victory. They don't believe in even in negotiating with the U.S. On the other hand, also, Afghanistan has changed. It's not the country that the Taliban encountered in the 1990s. I mean, we're seeing this in Kabul. This is not the city that they arrived last time around. It's a major city, it's sophisticated, it's big. Many things have happened in it that doesn't allow them to impose their will the way they did last time. And finally, when the Taliban rose in the 1990s, the bulk of the initial fighters, who later on became leaders, came out of these seminaries in Pakistan. Many were orphans. They hadn't even grown up in a regular social environment of a village or a town. This time, the Taliban are not necessarily orphan seminarians. A lot of them are people who have been in Afghanistan, and they also are using many of the facets of changes that have happened in that society, from cell phones, etc. So I think, we have to be skeptical, but it is like thinking about Mao when he was a young revolutionary versus Mao in 1970s. I mean, it's still a revolutionary, but it's not the same movement. And there's a danger that if we think too much in the mold of the 1990s, we won't understand both the new dangers, but also the new opportunities that are there. And it's important to look at the Taliban today, not so much in terms of what they were in the 1990s.
Yama, final question to you is, and a short answer if I could, is what do you see as being the fate of women and girls in Afghanistan, given the hopes that have been opened up and what we know from the past, albeit Taliban 1.0, about their appalling attitude to women and girls?
Well, I think there's two different, very extreme change how Taliban used to see to the issue of women's rights. In the past, they were not part of education. They were not allowed to work. Now they're open a bit, as though Dr. Miller says that, yes, though it's very generic terms, There has not been further clarity, but at least they say that based on Sharia law and based on this, Islamic laws, women and everybody has, the right for education, right to work. But how that would be practically seen? Well, at the same time, I've been watching a commander's interview that either bringing that protects that, they live in a far away, there's no access to the schools, but actually they also admit that nobody want to allow their girls to go to school. But in the cities, I think what I mentioned at the beginning, there's signs of hope. As Vali said, that, the people of Afghanistan is not the same. They have seen and they want to preserve what they've been given. They don't want to take it granted, but they try to see and also see the reaction of the Taliban. But what I'm proposing is the national community is to see the sign of hope and how, in a way contextually appropriate, can impose and can bring and can facilitate the process where the Taliban would start to realize practically what they mean, what they say, in concrete terms, in terms of supporting women's rights, freedom of speech, and have plans for that, and not let other commanders go causing problems in the field or in the periphery.
Thanks so much. Two last questions. One to you, Vali, and then we'll round out with Laurel. Vali, a question that I have is your sense of the geopolitics of what's happened in Afghanistan and what this means in particular for China. And Laurel, I'm going to go on to the question of the enduring damage to US regional and global standing from what's unfolded. But Vali, you first on the China question, geopolitics.
I mean, at some level, you would have said that the United States has basically left West Asia. Already the Chinese have a strategic partnership with Pakistan. They are negotiating one with Iran. They have a very big footprint in Central Asia, and they're also working with Russia there. There's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which now Iran has said it's going to join. In the past few days, Xi Jinping, Iran's new president, Putin have all been speaking together, particularly Iran and Russia, about Afghanistan. So you would have said that in an ideal scenario, if Afghanistan had a post-American stable government, that the Chinese sort of push into West Asia would be complete, and particularly eliminating India's access to Central Asia, which until now has been going through Iran and then Afghanistan. But if Iran begins to abandon that partnership with India under sanctions and shifts to China, that this basically would have been great for China. But the way in which things have turned out, I think, is a bit of a surprise. So even if that's over the horizon, maybe hope for the Chinese in the short run, I think the issue of massive instability in Afghanistan is a concern. First of all, because it has implications for both Iran and Pakistan, are countries that are important to the Chinese, as well as to Uzbekistan and Central Asia. And secondly, is also because the issue of Islamic politics or Islamic activism is important to them. It's not so much about terrorism as it is about inspiring Islamic insurgency as a way of essentially changing power relations, and particularly a sort of an Islamic war of liberation. The Chinese don't want that Afghanistan inspires Uzbek, Tajik, Kyrgyz Islamic fighters, nor do they want it to particularly inspire Uyghur Islamic fighters. And I think one of the things that it was discussed in Beijing when the Taliban met there is that the Chinese don't want any kind of a support for the Taliban for training facilities, education facilities, etc., for the Chinese Uyghurs, which are sort of just over the mountain. So I think in the very short run, much like the Iranians, much like the Pakistanis and the Russians, the main issue is how to manage the fallout from the US departure. And I think all of their calculation is also up in the air. Nobody expected the current crisis. So my sense is that one of the things that the Chinese could actually help is exactly to the issues that Laurel raised, which is if the Taliban really cannot access World Bank, IMF, their reserves, if the donor agencies disappear, if that 75% of their budget disappears, can the Chinese have leverage with them to basically say that there might be short-term stabilization assistance from China in order to just sustain the economy in exchange for, and that's always obviously with the Chinese, the sort of the quid pro quo is what to watch for. So I think they're much more engaged in Afghanistan than they were at least in the earlier phases of the war or the last time around.
Thanks so much, Vali. To conclude with you, Laurel, you mentioned before the impact on America's global standing from this. To round us out, what could the Biden administration have done differently to what they've just done? Some of us are fairly disappointed in the way in which this has been handled. And secondly, what's your sense of the enduring impact on American global standing? Over to you.
I mean, in terms of what to do, what could have been done differently, as that is connected to impact on American global standing, I'm not sure that I see that there are a number of practical things that could have been done differently in the withdrawal and evacuation process, but I'm not at all certain that those would have had a really significant effect on the pluses and minuses in terms of impact on American credibility. The difficulty with the credibility argument is it cuts both ways. You could say that withdrawing from Afghanistan, because it was inevitable that this kind of chaos would ensue, or some degree of chaos would ensue, and because there was no political settlement in the war, you were leaving in, failure, that negatively affects U.S. credibility. On the other hand, is U.S. credibility really enhanced by just continuing to pursue a war that was not winnable, that you could have lost more slowly rather than lost rapidly all at the end after 25 years of losing more, 20 years of losing more slowly. So, I think it's, I don't want to say it's completely a wash, but the credibility argument does cut both ways. And I think when it comes to whether US allies around the world and partners, particularly in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, are going to feel less sure about American reliability, I just think they're going to be looking much more at how the United States behaves vis-a-vis them and their interests than looking at Afghanistan as a reason to question American commitment. I just think they're going to be looking closer to home, and there's some evidence of that. I think India might be a little bit different case because Afghanistan is more important, more directly for India. But there are so many other reasons why India is hesitant to see the relationship with the United States flower to the degree that Washington would like, that this is one of a number of factors. And so I think it's hard to point to it as being decisive in any particular way. And then, the final thing I would just say is, the American failure in Vietnam was much greater in magnitude than the situation in Afghanistan. Not to say that the impact on Afghans isn't as great, but it was, I think, for Americans, particularly in terms of what the rationale was for being there, in terms of how many lives were lost, not only among Americans, but even more so among Vietnamese. It was the scale of everything there was much greater. And it had some impact, but it's not as if the United States was not a player around the world in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And I think that is a reason to be a little cautious about drawing conclusions from the situation in Afghanistan.
Yeah, wise and balanced remarks. Though I do wonder whether our friends in Delhi, having become the United States' new best buds through the Quad, will appreciate the level, caliber, and quality of collaboration in the navigation of the US exit, particularly given what will be perceived to be a general geopolitical win for Pakistan, I think. But we will have many, many months to reflect on that further. Can I thank our panel on behalf of the Asia Society, Laurel Miller, enormously experienced on the ground, in the field, and we wish you well in your work at the International Crisis Group, which is a great institution in practical problem solving around the world. Vali Nasr, a long-standing friend of the Asia Society. Thank you again, Vali, for being with us. You bring such seasoned expertise to bear in terms of a region often inaccessible to the collective Western mind. And to Mohammad, Nader, Yama. Yama, our thoughts are with you and all the people of Afghanistan, 34 million people whose futures are now in the balance as we start to think through how we can best support them at this critical time. I'm Kevin Rudd. I'm President and CEO of the Asia Society. Thank you for joining us, and keep tuned to upcoming events on this, on China, on Southeast Asia, on climate change, and the rest of what we cover through our institution and our network of 13 global